Welcome to the 5 Books, where each week we talk with a Jewish author about 5 books that are near and dear to them. My name is Tali Rosenblatt-Cohen, and today I'll be talking with Kitty Zeldis about her latest book, One of Them, about 2 young women at Vassar College in the wake of World War II. Kitty recalls her own time at Vassar decades later and how it set in motion lifelong questions about belonging.
I was confronted with what I can only describe as like a WASP tsunami. The Muffies and the Chips and the Flips and the Buffies. I just was overwhelmed. And it really sort of set up something in me about what does it mean to be a Jew in the big non-Jewish world? Because I'm not religious. I married a man who wasn't Jewish, and yet I am indelibly Jewish. So that question, I think, has been preoccupying me pretty much my whole adult life.
Kitty Zeldis is the pen name of Yonah Zeldis McDonough, a Brooklyn-based author of 9 novels, numerous essays, articles, and works of short fiction, as well as 40 books for children. She has worked for over 20 years as the fiction editor for the Jewish feminist magazine Lilith. In our conversation, Kitty tells the story of a German Jewish poet whose work transformed her understanding of culture and identity.
She's a Jew, and she writes in German. And it just completely turns my thinking about that around. There had been German Jews. They felt like Germans. They didn't feel separate from that. And in a way, to reject all that was to reject her and like to kill her all over again.
Kitty also shares a haunting story from Russia about her great-grandfather, who was a wealthy tanner.
So at one point, he went off on a business trip. He didn't come back, and he didn't come back. There's no cell phone. And at some point, his body, his murdered body, is delivered to the house in a filthy mail sack.
All that and more coming up next. Welcome to the 5 Books, Kitty. I'm so happy to talk to you today.
So happy to be here.
You are also known to many readers as Yonah Zeldis McDonough.
Mm-hmm.
You've brought so many stories into the world, from children's books to novels for adults, and I really appreciate how your work keeps coming back to these questions of Jewish identity and belonging. So I'm excited to talk to you about the books that shaped you. So can you tell us a little bit about this new book, One of Them, and what compelled you to tell this story?
This book started at Vassar College in 1974, where I was a freshman. I had no idea that I would write this book or any book, but I was a nice Jewish girl from Brooklyn, kind of lower middle class neighborhood, and went to a public school where all my classmates were white and Jewish. There were certainly Gentile kids. They were usually Italian Catholic or Irish Catholic, and they went to the parochial school. And there was no animosity. We saw them, they saw us. We'd say hi, they'd say hi, but we didn't hang out together. And then when I got to Vassar, I was confronted with what I can only describe as like a WASP tsunami. Like, what? Who are these people? I could not fathom them. The Muffies and the Chips and the Flips, it had gone co-ed by then, and the Buffies. I just was overwhelmed, and I was envious, I was disdainful, I was admiring, I was afraid, I felt inadequate. They just like set up a lot of feelings in me. In fact, that's how I became Kitty at college, because I said to a friend of mine, I was not McDonough yet, I said, Yonah Zeldis doesn't belong at Vassar. Catherine Ann Worthington belongs at Vassar. And he said, Kitty. And that was it. He's been calling me Kitty since 1978. And all the people I know through him, which are by now quite a number, also call me Kitty. So HarperCollins wanted a pen name when Not Our Kind came out, because I had been doing different kinds of things before. And they said, this is different enough, and we think you could use a relaunch. And Zeldis is my maiden name. And I thought, well, it's Kitty, of course. So I loved Vassar. And it wasn't as if there weren't Jewish students and Jewish faculty members, but I became aware of the fact that this was a place, when it was established, that excluded people like me. And my love for it had to kind of be tempered with that knowledge. And it really sort of set up something in me about, what does it mean to be a Jew in the big non-Jewish world? Because I'm not religious. I married a man who wasn't Jewish, and yet I am indelibly Jewish. So that question, I think, has been preoccupying me pretty much my whole adult life. So this book is really just a continuation of my own internal dialogue about that question. Only this one had a twist, because this is a girl who pretends not to be Jewish. Something I had sort of fantasized about, but I can't do that. I just can't. Like, it's not going to work.
I have so much I want to ask you about it. Can you tell our listeners who haven't read it yet, just like maybe a quick plot synopsis?
Sure. Two girls meet at Vassar in 1946. They're both Jewish, but one of them is pretending not to be Jewish. And she thinks that will solve various social problems that she's had in her young life. And it turns out to create all kinds of other problems. And the other girl is raised in France to American Jewish parents, but they live in France. And when the Nazis march in 1940, her parents, who still have their passports, decide this is not a good place for us and we are going to leave. But they leave under some stress and duress, and actually it turns out her mother gets left behind. So she's just not preoccupied with this at all. Like, that people, snub her at school, really, been there, done that. So it's kind of the two of them living their Jewishness differently, and they become friends. There is a betrayal. I won't say more.
Book 1, a Jewish book that shaped her Jewish identity. Dark Soliloquy, the collected poems of Gertrude Kolmar. You were born in Hadera in Israel.
Was.
Tell me how your family got there.
My parents are American. They lived in Detroit. They met at a Zionist youth movement called Habanim. My father, who was a few years older than my mother, she was 15 when she first showed up there. And my father was already in college, and he decided he was going to drop out of the University of Michigan, the first in his family to go to school, very bright and promising young man. And his mother, whom I only knew slightly, she died when I was 5, said, Israel, what is in Israel? Sand, shit, and flies. I think this is the best line ever, and I use it all the time. I always, give her credit for it. But he went, and my mother ran away from home and followed him there, and they lived there for 9 years, first at Chatzarim, which appears in this book, and later at in a moshav up north, I was born in Hadera, so it was near Hadera. And it was very important to them. And they came back to the States ostensibly for a year. My father also was a writer, and he had someone he wanted to study with at the new school, and then they never end up going back. Although ultimately, when they divorced, my father did move back there with his new wife, but my mother never returned.
That's so interesting. This book is set in Israel, Palestine, at that time that your parents were there.
Mm-hmm. My father went in 1949. So the state had already been formed.
Yeah.
He did not fight in the War of Independence, but shortly thereafter.
Did that attachment to Israel continue to loom large in your childhood?
Huge, but always as a kind of mythic place, because I didn't go back until I was 18. But my parents talked about it. It was so important to them. They spoke Hebrew at home when they didn't want me to understand. And to this day, when I hear people speaking Hebrew, like tears come into my eyes. I hear my parents talking to each other. So it kind of mystified me as much as it called to me, but we weren't affiliated Jewishly. I wanted to be part of the Jewish life that was available to me. Like my classmates, their families all belonged to the Jewish Center. The boys had bar mitzvahs. The girls weren't having bat mitzvahs quite yet. That took a little while. My father wouldn't do that. Well, we were kind of not exactly Jewish in the ways that we could have been. And I do fault my father for that. It was really his doing. Like, he didn't want to do Christmas. Okay, we're Jews. But he wouldn't do Hanukkah either. Mm-hmm. He said, no, it's not an important holiday. It's a capitulation to the commercialism of Christmas. All true. But if your children are Jewish, it's like you watch Christmas and everybody else is going to the best party in the world and you're not invited. Like, why not do Hanukkah? It is authentically Jewish. He thought all that was kind of middle class, and like for him it was Zionism, and that was the thing. But, what did that mean to me exactly, not having been raised there? So I had to kind of figure that out. And that was part of the reason I went to Israel when I was 18. I kind of wanted to follow them there and see like, what brought them there? What did they find? What was it like? How did it work for them,
And what was it like for you at 18?
Oh, really intense. I went to Chatzarim. First of all, I ended up in a kibbutz, not in my intention, but kibbutz Revivim, which was 3 kilometers from Chatzarim. And of course, I went to Chatzarim. There was a bus, and I get off the bus, and somebody says to me in Hebrew, At bat shel Malka, like your Malka's daughter. Like, what? She recognized me. I look a lot like my mother. And it was like 18 years later, and she was still living there. That was really intense. And I found out more about my parents' early life because my uncle moved there shortly after my mother, and he stayed. He met an Israeli woman and fell in love with her and stayed with her his for the rest of their lives. So he told me about what they were like back then, which was a total revelation to me. And I thought I would stay. I thought I would make Aliyah. But my uncle said, no, go back to the States and finish college first. Israel needs people who are educated. And I thought, okay, I'll do that. And by the time I graduated, like the urge had left me and I was going in a different direction.
And I know your path to writing was a pretty circuitous path. You started out as a dancer, right?
Yes, though I was never professional. By the time I was college age, I understood inchoately. I never said it to myself, but I knew I wasn't good enough and I wasn't ferocious enough about it. And you have to be both.
So tell me about the books that were really important to you as a kid and then how you found your way to writing.
Well, I did something as a kid. I don't know if you did this, but I reread the same book over and over again. Like, they were like old friends, you know, when you were homesick from school. There was only so much television during the day. So I read A Tree Grows in Brooklyn over and over. I read everything she wrote, but that was my favorite. And it was a Brooklyn girl who loved her father so much. And I was a Brooklyn girl who loved her father so much. And I read A Little Princess over and over again, which has a very, I think, evolved, despite its kind of racism, not kind of, it's racism and, you know, some very uncharitable thoughts about people who are not white. It's a deeply evolved book about what being a princess really means. And it's not about the externals, but it's about giving back to other people and thinking of other people and taking care of other people. It's a beautiful book. And the other big one was Anne of Green Gables, a girl that needs to find a home, and she does.
Did you know at that age that you wanted to write when you were small?
No, not at all. I was still busy doing the ballet thing. Then I got to college and I studied, well, lots of things, but art history is what I majored in. And I went to grad school in art history briefly, very ignominiously. I didn't seem to have, I was a very good student in college and I somehow had the idea, well, I like this and, you know, I'm good at this and I'll do more of this. And graduate school was nothing like undergraduate. You know, everybody had a briefcase. So I too bought a briefcase thinking, well, I like accessories. Didn't help. But I was able to take other classes. This was at Columbia. And I took a fiction writing class and I had the aha moment. Like, you mean you could do this? I'm going to do this. So I got the MA because I was already deeply in debt. And I thought, well, might as well get a degree. Might be useful somewhere, somehow. And then never look back. Though I do write about art and, you know, painting and sculpture.
I was going to say it's made its way.
Yes, yeah. And in other books too.
Yeah.
So
I wanted to talk to you about The Dark Soliloquy by Gertrude Kolmar. So I sadly didn't really know about her.
Because no one knows about her. She's like,
once I researched her to talk to you, I was like, I need to be reading this.
So I found this book in, I think it was Brentano's then. It's been a few things. On 8th Street, there was a big bookstore on the corner of 6th Avenue and 8th Street. Anyway, they had books on a table for 59 cents, and I picked one up. That was even then less than the price of a subway token. And I should preface this by saying I had graduated from college, and in college I had taken a German course because I knew I wanted to go to graduate school in art history, and German was a requirement. I was going to have to take a language proficiency exam. I did not want to take German. I had like this sort of reflexive attitude. German, Jew, like that Venn diagram is not working. Like we don't. And I was a good student and I got good grades and I got like a C my first semester in German and I was proud of it. So then I'm in this bookstore and I pick up this book and I start reading it. And there's German on one side and English on the other. It's a dual language edition. And I find out, first of all, she's a Jew. And she writes in German, or she wrote in German. And she had an opportunity to leave Germany and she didn't because she had an elderly father who wouldn't go. And she didn't want to leave him and they both were murdered in Auschwitz. And I bought the book and I started reading it. And it just completely turns my thinking about that around. That early position was too easy. That it was just more complex than that. There had been German Jews. They felt like Germans. They didn't feel separate from that. And in a way to, you know, reject all that was to reject her and like to kill her all over again. You know, to not read her in German when that's what she wrote in German. So it really kind of shifted my thinking about complexity in the world. That, yes, obviously what happened then was terrible, but it doesn't mean this wholesale rejection of a culture because of that. And then some years later, I went to Vienna with my husband, and I was ravished by it. And my mother said the same kind of thing to me. She said, I'd never go there. And I just found it so beautiful and moving and sad, but in the way, like, Jews were a huge part of the intellectual, cultural, artistic life there. And they shaped that city. And in a way, when we were kicked out, it sort of paved the way to the decline. Being there, I felt like, well, you tried to get rid of us and you didn't. Like, here I am back again, like the proverbial cockroach, the Jewish girl, like back in this city, feeling both part of it and not part of it. I went to Freud's apartment. His name is still, above the bell on the door. Like, how do we get around that? So Colmar kind of opened me up to that way of thinking. And I'm so glad I went to Vienna. I feel like enriched by it and nourished by it.
Can you give us a little flavor of what her poetry was like?
That's hard to do, but let me try to think. Animal, like envisioning herself as a creature under the sea or a mermaid. Sensual, original. They're poems I go back to, even now.
Do you know anything about how her poetry survived?
No, actually, I don't. I might have known this at one point, but she certainly had some reputation in her lifetime. And at some point, she did start writing in Hebrew near the end of her life. She saw the writing on the wall, and I think she was wanting to move towards her Jewish identity and say, I'm going to write in Hebrew.
Book 2, a Jewish book that impacted her Jewish identity. Goodbye, Columbus, by Philip Roth.
I love that book. It's still my favorite Roth novel. He was wildly condemned for it when it came out, excoriated by the Jewish community. Like, how could you do this? How could you give them more ammunition for hating us? And in a funny way, like, I've been interested in the intersection between Jew and non-Jew. And he's like at the same emotional place, but Jew and Jew, right? The lower class Jewish boy from Newark, what's his name? Neil Klugman or Klutznick. He's got some terrible name. And Brenda Potamkin from the upscale town. And he feels the same things, like the exclusion, the lesser than, something that he wants so badly. I don't remember whether this is in the book, because there's also a movie of it too. But I remember the scene from the movie where he goes into the basement and he's eating the cherries, and the little sister sees him doing it, and he's shamed, like, that he wants this abundance and this richness and this luxury, and he will never have it. Certainly not with her. And never is the sense that you get. He's just not going to do that. So I love that he's kind of put himself in that place. The more obvious thing is Jew and Gentile. But he's saying, no, I want to explore this thing between different kinds of Jews and how they interact and feel about each other and what's going on. And, she has this very aspirational family. I don't know that they want to be Christian. It's not like that, but they certainly want to fit in better.
That's definitely a theme in this book and some of your other books. You mentioned that feeling resonated for you. Mm-hmm. So tell me more about that.
Well, I think that was what I first encountered at Vassar, like these people who just seemed so comfortable in the world. Like, they'd been here a very long time compared to my family. I mean, I have a grandmother, well, now she's gone, but I had a grandmother who was born in Russia and who had a particularly traumatic childhood. I mean, all immigrant stories are traumatic and dramatic, but hers was more so than others, I think. And, that just shapes you. I told her once, I was in my early 20s, I was going to Paris, and she said, Oy vey, just like that. And I said, no, Grandma, not Treblinka, Paris. But now I understand better, from her point of view, why would you go someplace so far away where no one knows you and loves you and cares about you? It's dangerous to do that. Like, stay with the people who care about you. Stay where there's protection and safety. And
what was
had
her
a terrible
story?
Life.
Yeah.
She was from, interestingly enough, an affluent Jewish family. Her father was a tanner in Russia, in Ekaterinoslav. And tanning was a profession Jews were allowed to have because it was so disgusting, no one wanted to do it. One of the main components was urine. Like, need I say more? He had a factory. And she was one of many children. We don't know exactly how many, but maybe 12 or 13. And they lived in a big house with wooden floors and velvet drapes and crystal chandeliers. She was the second to youngest, and then there was a younger sister still. And the older sisters had dancing lessons and music lessons, and the boys went to a military academy. Jewish boys in Russia in the 19th century were not going to military academies, but those boys did. So there must have been some, exception made given my great-grandfather's position. So at one point he went off on a business trip. He didn't come back, and he didn't come back. There's no cell phone. And at some point, his body, his murdered body, is delivered to the house in a filthy mail sack that they find. And her mother takes poison when this happens. But she doesn't die. But my grandmother did tell me, I remember the burns around her mouth. Wow. And she must have rallied. And by this point, the revolution had started, and she put mattresses in the windows. And she picked up everything she could literally carry from that house and went out and left my grandmother, who was 6, and her younger sister, who was 4, alone all day, selling crystal, silverware, tchotchkes, rugs if they were small enough to get enough money. And my grandmother told me she remembers her sister would say, "Where's Mama? Where's Mama?" And she'd say, "She's coming." So the 6-year-old has to comfort the 4-year-old. And she managed to put together enough money to take the 4 or 5 youngest, because the older ones had already married and made families and, were settled. And she took them first to Riga, which was a port city, and then to New York. And then things didn't get much easier for her when she got to the States. But nevertheless, like that as a beginning, like I never asked her, and I regret this now, she was a very difficult woman, ferocious, small. My mother used to call her the tiny tyrant. Prone to rages and yelling, and like not only did she get mad, she stayed mad. She wasn't giving it up. So I didn't ask her questions, and when she would talk to me about the past, I was like, yeah, like, can we do something else now? And now I wish I had asked, like, were you there when they found your father's body? Like, what? How did that happen? And there was nothing identifying on him. There must have been, but they don't know how it got there. Only he was religious enough that he had payas and maybe a prayer shawl and a Bible. So somebody knew he was Jewish and made the effort to find his family, because they figured, rightly so, like they'd be wondering about him and to get him back there. So I wish I'd asked her about those things. It's a pretty amazing story. I use it in dressmakers. I give it to someone else. That happens to her.
Wow, that's fascinating. Going back to Roth, he is pretty merciless, right, about Jewish life in that mid-century America.
He's merciless about everything.
Yeah.
He is not known for his kindness.
How did you understand him taking aim at his own community? Did it feel like liberating or uncomfortable, or?
Not uncomfortable. No, liberating, because I have felt those kinds of things. I don't think love should mean that it can't be mixed with criticism, or I'm trying to think of the word I want. It was like what I was saying about Vassar earlier. That foundation was not a pretty one, right? And yet I love the place and feel so lucky to have gone there, and it absolutely shaped my life. Look, I'm still writing about it how many years later. So those two things are not incongruent to me, that you can love something and yet see its failures and its flaws and the things that make you exasperated about it. I just think that's kind of part of being human. Like, it doesn't have to be all one way, right?
I was going to ask you about Roth's treatment of women, and I wonder if you have the same answer.
Sometimes it's a little hard to take.
Yeah.
Roth's treatment of women, particularly when he writes them as, there's something almost reflexive about them. They are never subjects. They are only objects. Only objects. And, there are plenty of male writers, well, maybe not plenty, but there are certainly male writers. Tennessee Williams, who writes gorgeous, nuanced, sensitive portraits of women. Not a woman, never been a woman. And yet he could stretch himself to that place. They're completely their own people. Completely. Roth couldn't do that. That was a limitation of his work. But, I don't think we have to cancel him because of it.
Right. I was going to ask you also about there's the push and pull of generational change in American Jewish life and old Newark and suburban affluence. You're talking about your grandmother's life, and we see that tension playing out in some of your fiction, and it sounds like in your life. I wonder how you relate to that.
Well, I had those old world grandparents, but isn't that always true, in generations? I mean, I'm sure to my children it's like, oh, Mom,
It's always there. I guess it's interesting to me because you return to the past in your books. Mm-hmm. And so, when you do that, I feel like, it's inevitable that you bring your own modern sensibility to it, but it's also often that you're like pulling at different threads and making sense of things in a different way from the past.
Well, I think these themes of, the anti-Semitic themes, they are still very much present. These issues were even more sharply delineated in the 1940s. Like the working title for Not Our Kind was restricted. And that was a word that was used openly and proudly. Like, you don't like those people, in brochures, in literature about neighborhoods and hotels and whatnot. You don't like those people? Don't worry. Not going to find them here. You can relax. Like, nobody was ashamed of that. Like, you wouldn't let it be known that you were doing that. Nope. We're just like out there.
No blacks, no Jews, no dogs.
Right. Yeah. So I found the 40s kind of a good time to write about those things. And even the intersection between Jews and non-Jews. For instance, when I was a child, all my Jewish friends had Jewish parents. Now, I married a man who isn't Jewish. My kids say almost all their friends have this, have one parent who's one thing and one parent who's another thing. So setting it in the past. And then I always liked the past. Like when I was a kid, I liked books. The books I mentioned to you were all written many years before I was born. I guess I've always been drawn to the past. I like old things.
Book 3, A Book That Changed Your Worldview, Lolita, by Vladimir Nabokov.
I've read Lolita maybe 6 times. So it's one of the few books I've reread as an adult. And I read it the first time when I was 17 in college. And I thought it was hilarious. I just thought it was so funny and witty. And I almost felt like, how could she not love him? He's like such a great guy. And in my subsequent readings, that changed. And I began to see, the last time I read it was a few years ago. And I thought, I'm not reading this ever again. He's a monster. He's ruined her life. How can there be anything charming or witty? That's all negated by this huge, monstrous thing that he's done. And he does know that he's done it. There is that. There's a great scene, which I learned Nabokov actually wrote almost at the beginning, and he had to write his way to it. She's already disappeared. She's already left him, and he's in a car somewhere and, grieving and mourning her and feeling sicker and sicker. And he gets out of the car. He can't drive anymore, and he throws up. And he finds himself, and he calms down and, kind of pats his face dry with a handkerchief and wipes his mouth. And he realizes he's at like the top of a cliff or a glen or something, and he hears the sounds of children playing below. And they're laughing and they're shouting, and he realizes that the great tragedy is not that she's not by his side, that she's not down there with those children, that he's robbed her of that, of her life as a child, her childhood. And it is a great moment. But what about that book? Is it, Europe kind of sullying America? Is it America destroying Europe? It's both of those things. The wit of it, the poignance of it, how you could be so funny and so deep at the same time. I just think it's one of the greatest books I've ever read. And I discovered early on that my husband loved it too. And when we were first dating, we read it to each other. We took turns reading it. It took about 3 months, but we do it at night, a couple of chapters. It was great to hear it aloud. And we got the annotated Lolita, so we could dig in and find, all these little things that you wouldn't necessarily know about it.
He's the master of unreliable narration.
Yes, exactly. But you don't know it right away, right? Because he's so urbane and in control and so funny and so calm that you don't realize until well into it that he's a madman.
Book 4, the book you're reading now, The Empresses of 7th Avenue by Nancy McDowell.
which is about 3 department stores and the 3 women who ran them. And I love department stores. They are in sad decline. But like this was a part of American life and American experience, like that probably had its peak in the 50s and 60s. And you wouldn't think that women would have such outsized roles in them, but they did, in part because those stores were catering to women, and women know what other women want in a store. So I'm quite enjoying that.
Book 5, the author's latest book, One of Them, by Kitty Zeldis. As we talked about, the beginning of the book is set in Vassar when these 2 characters meet. You went to Vassar. What was it like for you in the 70s? You talked a little bit about the Muffies and the chips. Did you personally experience any anti-Semitism?
I did. Not a lot, but, there was a garden variety. I had a roommate freshman year who said, well, you people killed Christ, but I heard that before. Or why did you keep talking about the Holocaust? I'd heard that before. What was different, and this is the perfect story that sort of crystallizes it for me. I told you I, was an art history major, and I went to all the things. I was an involved student. So whenever there was a lecture or a reading or something that happened, I was there. So one night there was a lecture about Rococo painting. Very light, very frothy, lots of big dresses and hats. And there was a visiting German professor who was giving this lecture. So I went with a friend who was a poli-sci major. So she wasn't as into it, but she went with me. We sit in the front row. And they're giving his background. And I don't know what I thought I'd hear about the war years. I mean, I didn't actually give it any thought, but we're like 30 years out from the war. This is in the mid-70s. And we hear that he's a high-ranking general in the army. And my friend, who's more woke than I am, she pokes me and she said, do you understand he's a Nazi? Like, you don't get that position. It's not like you're just some young guy being drafted, right? Like, that means you're in this. She said, we got to go. So we get up to everybody's annoyance and leave. And we spent the rest of the night talking about it in my room, with the indignation only 2 20-year-olds could have. How could they? How dare they? So the next morning, I marched myself over to the art history department. And I asked to see the chairman, and I said, so what was with that? Like inviting or not. She said, actually, we didn't invite him. It was a German department. So righteous indignation still intact. I go marching across campus, and I asked to see the chairman of the German department. And he's a very nice man, and he listens to this whole story and, patiently. And at the end of it, I said, so what did you think we were going to think, like the Jewish? He said, quite honestly, it never occurred to us that, like, your background, your singularity, like, we don't even see you. Wow. You don't exist, in a sense.
Given that experience and the fact that you said it in the 40s, I guess it's not so surprising how these 2 characters relate so differently to their Judaism. So maybe you could just tell us a little bit about both Anne and Delia in terms of how they relate to their Jewishness.
Well, Anne has grown up amid WASPs, unlike me. And she is accepted by them to a certain point, but there's always that place where she can't quite go. There's a restricted camp where her best friend is, and she wants to go, and she can't. There's a luncheon at the Colony Club to which she's invited, and she gets disinvited. And this was true of the Colony Club up certainly through the 80s, because I know a Jewish woman who married a WASPy guy, and his father said, if you want to join these clubs, you have to do it now before you marry her. So she thinks that by pretending to not be Jewish, she'll just leapfrog over all of that, And she's got this Goyish last name, and she uses her middle name. Her actual given name is Miriam. But it seems like a place for a relaunch. She has one too. Only she finds that actually it creates a whole other set of problems she couldn't even begin to imagine. And as for Delia, what I said about her earlier, she's much more worldly, and she's already been through some harrowing experiences. In Paris, it didn't seem to matter that she was Jewish. Her family was accepted. They were intellectuals, artists, in that sort of bohemian circle. They had a lot of money, so, there wasn't that problem. She didn't need to think about it much until she does when she gets to Vassar, but it doesn't trouble her particularly. She's thinking about other things.
One of the most striking aspects is how Anne, who had been Miriam, She kind of just tolerates the casual anti-Semitism of her friend group, as long as it's not directed at her. And she engages with what the other girls say about Delia, because they do talk about her in a negative way, which is in large part informed by the fact that they understand her to be Jewish. Do you see that as a survival strategy, self-betrayal, something more complicated?
More of a survival strategy. I mean, it makes her very uncomfortable, and she tries to change the conversation, the direction of it when she can. But she's also aware that she doesn't feel up to siding with Delia, lest she lose the support and friendship of these girls whom she's decided she needs. She needs this, and she doesn't want to be ostracized. So she's willing to put up with it. She feels it's kind of like a necessary thing she has to do.
I won't explain exactly how, but the characters end up in Israel. And
in Palestine.
In Palestine.
Yes, it becomes Israel in the course of the book. But when they first go there, it's still Palestine.
It's 1946.
It's actually the winter of 47.
Okay.
And early 48.
It was unusual to me to see that moment in time from this vantage point, especially these are wealthy, acculturated Jews. They're not there from the ideology and
no, not at all.
Jewish attachment that you're describing your parents had, which is, I think, more of when I think of Americans going at that time, that's what I know it as. And you also see it from the perspective of Drew, who's not Jewish, and he's a photographer, another character in the story. It's travel, it's part of a quest, it's a love story. I just wondered about portraying it from that vantage point.
I mean, it was kind of like what I had written myself into. When I sold this book on a few sample chapters and a synopsis, and Palestine was not in them. So I didn't know that I was going there. But once I got them to Paris, I was feeling like hemmed in, like I wanted them to go somewhere else. And then when it occurred to me, I thought, they're going to go to Israel. Oh my God. And I would get to write about that, which excited me. And there was lots that I ended up cutting about it. I lived on a kibbutz when I went there when I was 18. And one of the jobs I had was working in the chicken coop. And I had so much in there about the chickens and various things that happened with the chickens. And my editor said, I think we can lose a lot of this. I don't think we need it in here. And we didn't. I mean, I know I didn't. It was extraneous, but I wanted to write it. I wanted to write all about those chickens. I wanted to go back there. I just once I thought of it, I did want to write about it. And I have written about it before. I have several linked stories. I mean, probably enough for a collection about Israel. But you're right. I didn't really think about that. It's not from my parents' point of view. My parents they had drunk that Kool-Aid. My father renounced his American citizenship. They thought this was it for them. They were going to stay there. Not so for these girls. It's other things that bring them there. And then when they get there, they have to think about what does it mean to be there. And in Jill's case, once the state is declared, she leaves. She doesn't want to be there because what it says to her is there's going to be war. There's going to be disruption. There's going to be violence. I've been through that.
Right.
No, thank you. She doesn't feel this commitment to it at all. She feels frightened.
I don't want to say too much about Delia's mother and her trajectory, except to say that she was an artist, and that art becomes a through line in the book. And Delia and her father are on the last ship to leave, and she feels like she's been abandoned by her mother. I guess what I'm thinking about is just there's so much rupture and then bringing things back together. Just wondered if you had any thoughts on what that means to you.
Well, I think I want to write happy or happy-ish endings. Mm-hmm. I just don't want it to be too bleak at the end. I kind of can't stand it. Mm-hmm. I have to go where there's a little light and a little hope of redemption. And
I am a reader who appreciates a happy ending. We don't get them in real life all the time. We don't get them in real life all the time, right?
Yeah. And we don't even get them in fiction all the time.
Yeah.
But I am drawn to that, maybe I'm comforting myself. See, sometimes it does turn out okay.
You mentioned that Kitty was a nickname, and then that your publisher sort of suggested that you do a relaunch. But I was thinking about it in the context of you have a character who changes her name. Mm-hmm. And I wonder what it's like for you using a pseudonym.
Well, in some ways I love it because my name, which you divulged, I've always hated my name. Always. And every time I had to say it anew, I died a little bit inside. And, I haven't quite forgiven my mother for it, although I understand, and really I should. She's 94 and in a wheelchair. But I was born in Israel. She wasn't giving me like a weird name just to be contrary. But they didn't anglicize my name, which they could have when I got here. And I remember when I was in 4th grade, we moved. So I went to a new school and the teacher was looking at the class list and she said, Yona Zeldis. What is Yona Zeldis? What? And I had to raise my hand and say it was me. She didn't recognize it as a name. Now that wouldn't happen. People are more sensitive about that and right, inclusion and diversity and all that. But so that.
Did people even recognize it as being Hebrew?
No, but they'd ask and then I'd have to say, right? Like, what is that? And then, and so that would immediately stamp you like, oh, Jew.
Yeah.
So being Kitty is like such a relief. I just love being Kitty. And I've been Kitty for a long time, so it doesn't feel weird at all. I mean, the only thing I feel a little sad about is that I've written some books I like under the other name, and I'm kind of estranged from them. But on my website, I have 2 websites. I have a Kitty Zeldis website and I have a Yona Zeldis McDonough website. And the Yona Zeldis McDonough website has a Kitty Zeldis tab on it. So I think,
yes,
all right.
I didn't put together that you had written The Doll Shop Downstairs, which is one of my kids' favorite books.
Really? Oh, that's so nice.
So I was so excited to put it all together. But do you identify with Anne in that way for like being able to drop an identity that just...
Well, she takes it further. I cannot drop the identity. Like, it's ingrained in me. It's too late to be anything other than Jewish. Whatever that means, whatever kind of cultural stamp that puts on you.
And, we'll talk a little bit about your children's books. You've written so many books that deal with Jewish identity. What is it that compels you to keep coming back to
I don't know. That is really a good question. But I have said, like, particularly before I was doing this, like, I am most Jewish in my writing. In my
and you're at Lilith,
story.
Right? You've been at Lilith for almost 20 years?
Yes, more
than
20 years. Yeah. Lilith is a wonderful place. I always want to give a shout out to Lilith. We are wonderful women who work there, run it, and I think we're a wonderful magazine.
I have a soft spot for Lilith. But anyway, so you just keep coming back to it in your writing.
I can't get away from it. I would like to get away from it. My son, who goes through the world with the name James Redden McDonough, has said to me, Mom, you always want to know who's Jewish. And I say, you bet I do. It's like so weird to be Jewish in the West, right? Everybody else became Christian. But there we are, like Bartleby, standing aside, like all that gorgeous stuff you're doing, the churches, the pageantry, the music, the stained glass. We prefer not to. Like, why? Why did we take that position? And yet it has defined us. It has become like literally part of who we are. Like the ones who are not going to do that. Like that's just no. We just don't.
That is like straight from Abraham, right?
Right.
Like the iconoclasts who are just...
Right. Like we're just... And I am eternally interested in that.
So what are you working on next?
Well, I have an idea for something, part of which would be set in the 18th century in Amsterdam. So I'm going to go to Amsterdam in the spring. But it's a big climb. For instance, there was one scene in it where there's a little girl who wants to light a candle. She can't use a match, can she? No, matches don't exist until like 1830-something. And I do some research, and it's a tinder box. I've heard of the tinder box. Like I remember it from a fairy tale, but I don't know what it is actually. So I have to look it up and see a picture of it and think like, okay, so where is it and how do you use it? And like all this for 2 sentences.
Right.
Right? That aren't even that important. I just have to get that candle lit. And you think you have to multiply this by like every single thing. You have to ask yourself, so how would that have happened? You can't just assume that you know, because you don't.
I guess you were ready to take on an ambitious project.
I guess I was ready. I don't feel quite ready. But maybe by the spring, I'll have calmed down and I'll go to Amsterdam and see the tulips, which will be wonderful. And maybe I'll get some inspiration for this story.
Terrific. Well, in the meantime, I love this book. I love the characters. And there's so many bigger themes there. It's a different way of looking at the past, and I really appreciated being in their world for a little while. So,
thank you.
Thank you for...
That's a nice thing to hear.
Yeah.
It really is.
Thank you for joining us today, and I'm excited to read what comes next.
Well, thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us today for the 5 books. Our guest today was Kitty Zeldis talking about her new book, One of Them. You can find a link to the book and all the others Kitty discussed in our show notes. If you've read one of the wonderful books recommended on our show, we'd love to hear about it. Drop us a comment on Instagram @5bookspod or in our email, team@5bookspod.org. If you'd like an email reminder to keep you up to date with new episodes, plus links to all the books we discussed, and some other goodies directly into your inbox, you can sign up for our newsletter in the show notes or on our website, 5bookspod.org, where you can also find transcripts for all episodes. I'm Tali Rosenblatt-Cohen. Our producer is Odelia Rubin. Editorial and website support from Sarah Waring and Amelia Merrill. Music by Dove Rosenblatt and Blue Dot Sessions. Art by Elad Lifshitz of Dove Abramson Studio. Thanks especially to the Jewish Book Council.